Welcome to Business Talk, a global podcast series spotlighting distinguished faculty and the powerful ideas emerging from their research, designed to inspire scholars, professionals, and leaders worldwide. I am Deepak, your host for today's episode. We are honored to welcome Professor Anand Pandian as our distinguished guest on Business Talk today. Before we get started, I would like to introduce today's guest. Dr. Anand Pandian is the Krieger-Eisenhower Professor of Anthropology at Johns Hopkins University, where he also holds a joint appointment in Earth and Planetary Sciences. His work explores how people imagine and inhabit changing worlds, a theme that runs through his widely read books, including A Possible Anthropology, Methods for Uneasy Times, and Something Between Us, The Everyday Worlds of American Life and How to Take Them Down, published by Stanford University Press. A former chair of the anthropology department at Johns Hopkins, Dr. Pandin served as the president of the Society for Cultural Anthropology through 2025, contributing to the field's evolving conversations on methods, ethics, and public engagement. Beyond academia, he is a curator of the Ecological Design Collective, a collaborative platform dedicated to rethinking ecological futures through creating and collective practice. Based in Baltimore with his family, he is currently at work on a new book that traces global effort towards a zero-waste future, drawing on stories and experiments from the United States, India, Ghana, and Spain. In today's episode, Professor Anand Pandian joins us to unpack the key insights from his new book, Something Between Us, The Everyday Worlds of American Life and How to Take Them Down, an anthropologist's journey across the United States to understand the deep social and political divides shaping American life and the everyday strategies that can help us bridge them. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Anand Pandian to the conversation. Professor Anand, it's a distinct privilege to welcome you to Business Talk. We are grateful to you for accepting our invitation.
Thank you so much, Deepak. It really is an honor to join you today.
Thank you. Professor, you frame division not just as ideology, but as something built into everyday life. When did you first begin to see separation as something materially constructed?
It's an important question. I think that in countries around the world right now, whether it's the United States or India or many other places, we are accustomed to thinking a lot about political polarization and about sharp lines of social and cultural conflict. We have so many instances of difficult situations in which people just seem to be so deeply divided to the point where the simple possibility of coexistence comes to seem more and more fraught. And I wanted to try to make sense of this particular situation, this particular challenge, as an anthropologist, as a cultural anthropologist. That's my field of expertise. That's what I'm trained to do. And as anthropologists, what we do is we pay attention to how people live, what their habits are, how they relate to each other, the ideas and the ideas they use and the way they imagine what it means to share life with other people in particular societies. We pay attention, in other words, to the various details of their everyday lives. And so when we wrestle with challenges like polarization and social and political division, my instinct as an anthropologist is to begin simply with the facts of everyday life. If we're worried about division, how are people actually divided from each other on a day-to-day basis? Where do they live? Where are the other people they live around? How do they encounter others on an everyday basis? Do they encounter others on an everyday basis? And the book as a whole makes the argument that if we want to understand these patterns of social and political division, we have to look at those infrastructures of daily life. And in fact, those infrastructures hold very important clues to why it is that things have gotten so difficult in the United States, but perhaps also in other countries around the world.
Professor, in your travels across the US, how did geography, small town versus cities, coast versus interiors shape the kinds of walls people experience?
Yeah. In the United States, there is a lot of talk these days about deep and essential differences between life, say, in larger cities and smaller rural environments, between life on the coasts, the east and west coast of the United States, and life in the areas in between the coasts, what some people have described as flyover country. That is to say, the areas of the country that elites living in these coastal states might simply know mainly by flying over them when they're going from one coast to another. Now, there are a lot of people who have tried to suggest or show in various ways that the divisions in the United States, say the division between liberal and conservative people, can somehow be mapped onto those very large scale geographic divisions. But my contention, my intuition, and what I try to show in the book is that we actually do have to think about these patterns at a smaller scale, that every locality will have people who lean in one direction and lean in another. And there's a lot at stake in trying to understand why it is that people wind up with the ideas they wind up with in different kinds of geographical circumstances. And one of the arguments I make in the book is that a lot of this has to do with the textures of everyday life in these different places. If people tend to live far apart from each other, whether they're in cities or in smaller towns or in the countryside, if they tend to spend most of their time outside their homes in private automobiles, where they're not really interacting physically very much at all with others around them, if they tend to get all of their news from partisan political platforms, that is to say, platforms that are designed to give them ideas that they already are familiar with, or ideas that they already know or agree with. If all those different forms of isolation are already at work in their daily lives, then regardless of where they live geographically, they may find themselves in a certain kind of bubble and may be much more likely to take familiar ideas more seriously than more unfamiliar ideas.
Professor, write about fear and suspicion becoming normalized. What role does everyday routine play in reinforcing those emotional boundaries?
It's really important because I think that in so many countries right now, in the United States, but also in India and in other countries that are struggling with regard to the fabric of their democratic life, there's a lot of concern around others, their narratives around others, the place of others, the place of people who are different by virtue of their language or their religion or their race or ethnicity. The notion that somehow if someone comes from a different background, they may not belong or they should not belong in these places. In those discourses, when we think about others, when generalizations are made about the dangers posed by others or the anxieties provoked by the presence of others among us, it's very easily to imagine those others as abstractions, as phantoms, as figures of the imagination. But part of the reason I think, and what I try to show in the book, part of the reason why it's so easy to generalize about others, to treat others as abstractions, to say very general things about one's suspicions or doubts or anxieties about the very possibility of coexisting with people who are different, so much of that just has to do on an everyday scale with the extent to which you actually live in the company of others. Are you interacting with people that you don't know on a daily basis? Do you even see people you don't know on a daily basis? And one of the things that I try to show in the book is that all over the United States, people are living in everyday circumstances of much greater isolation. One of the patterns that I chart in the book has to do with the way in which, for many decades, Americans spent a lot more time on their front porches in the company of others who are walking by or passing through their neighborhoods and engaged in casual forms of interaction with people they don't know that well. People have retreated now to their living rooms or the back of their houses, places where they're only likely to interact with others they already know. And my argument is that everyday patterns of that kind can really contribute in a serious way to those fears, to those suspicions, and to these habits of treating others as abstractions rather than actual living, breathing, real people with feelings of their own and needs of their own, but also people that we can relate to and build relationships with.
Professor, the idea of fortified living is striking. How do homes, vehicles, and even digital spaces contribute to a subtle culture of distancing?
So, the book that we are talking about, Something Between Us, is a project that I began working on around the time of the presidential election in the United States in 2016. And in particular, it was the promise of a border wall, of a kind of fortified boundary between the United States and Mexico and its other southern neighbors that I was really curious about. It clearly had a lot to do with the success of President Trump's election campaign that year. And I wanted to understand why the promise of that kind of fortification appealed so much to so many Americans, to millions of Americans, why it was that thousands of people all over the country would chant in unison, build the wall, when they were speaking about the idea of a wall that might come up in a place that was sometimes hundreds or even thousands of miles from where they lived. Why would people get so passionate about that kind of fortification? And thinking about that question as an anthropologist, what I came to realize and what I try to show in the book is that ideas like that, the promise of that kind of fortification at the national level, appeals deeply, more deeply, I would say, to people who are already accustomed to different forms of fortification on an everyday basis. And when you look at the way in which homes in the United States are getting more and more fortress like with all the security that they now have, when you look at the way in which more and more Americans live in gated and walled off neighborhoods where the only people around them are people that have proven somehow that they belong in that space. When you look at the size of American automobiles, which have gotten so massive, and the way in which people have come to take for granted that the only way to move about safely on our streets is in vehicles that look and feel almost like armored tanks or enclosures. When you think about our social media, once again, that draw these walls between ideas that we want to see and ideas that we don't want to see, stories that we want to absorb and stories we don't want to absorb. When you think about even our cultures of the body and the way in which Americans have come in many ways to imagine their own individual bodies as fortresses, even to protect from contact with others. All these different dimensions of our everyday culture, I would say, dispose people to want more fortification, to fear the absence of fortification, to feel vulnerable and uncomfortable in the absence of hard boundaries between themselves and others. That has a lot to do, I argue in the book, with the various forms of xenophobic politics that have really come to organize our conversations around immigration and the very place that foreigners may have in an American polity.
Professor, did you encounter moments where people consciously resisted these divisions? What did those efforts look like on the ground?
It's a really important question because if all we could do is simply talk about how terribly impossible these circumstances have gotten, that would be a really difficult and deflating read. But the book is called Something Between Us for two reasons. On the one hand, you can take the something between us to have to do with the kinds of barriers we've been talking about until now, the things that rise up between different people and make relationships more complicated. But the phrase something between us can also stand for the reality of a relationship, the reality of a connection, the existence of an underlying unity. And what I try to show in the book is that there are developments of other kinds that are at work as well in the United States. That as much momentum as there is for this politics of wall building and isolation and division, there are people who are organizing in the name of a different vision of collective life and collective responsibility, one that takes seriously what we need from each other, what we can offer each other as members of a society in which we really need to look to each other for mutual caretaking. And so I spend a lot of time in the book as well with activists and organizers who are working for different forms of social justice, like racial justice, gender justice, environmental justice, clean water, safe roads, different ways of organizing for a picture of social life that takes really seriously the idea that our security is best met in relation to each other through whatever practices we can muster up to ensure our collective well-being rather than insisting solely on the idea that I can take care of myself best by walling myself off.
Professor, our conversation spanned a wide social spectrum. Were there surprising points of empathy or shared concern that cut across political lines?
Absolutely. And I should just start by saying that a field like mine, a field like cultural anthropology, depends on the possibility of striking up conversations with people you don't know, of opening up lines of dialogue and connection, sometimes even opening up and creating relationships with people that you not only have very little in common with, but sometimes people that you disagree with fundamentally. So, one thing we take really seriously as anthropologists is the possibility of building those kinds of bridges. It's a methodological imperative for those of us who do this kind of research. And certainly, a project like this one arises out of my own political concerns. I was really worried about the direction we were going in as a country. And I was worried because I am politically progressive. I do have certain ideas around social and economic justice that motivate my teaching and my writing and the other work that I do as an academic, but also as a public citizen. So certainly, I have ideas of my own and commitments of my own, but I knew that to do this work effectively, I had to actually connect with people that I disagree with, connect with people that I might have very little in common with, connect with people that I might sometimes even get into deep disagreements with. And that's a lot of what the book is about. It's about my effort to do that. I spend a lot of time, in particular, with people on the conservative side of the political spectrum, which is not where I would position myself, in different parts of the country, and wind up in really interesting conversations. Sometimes those conversations arrive at forms of impasse and misunderstanding and places where you can't really go any further. Sometimes they even end in failure, but sometimes they also end in genuine, meaningful connections. And I have interesting stories of that kind that I tell in the book. I'm still in touch with many of these folks that I write about in the book. And it's been really interesting, actually, even just observing together the ways in which the political conversation in the United States has changed and evolved over these last years.
Professor, how does the American emphasis on individualism complicate the possibility of building a more collective social fabric?
This is a very important question. And it's important in particular to think about things like individualism as cultural attributes. It is not the case that people in every culture, in every part of the world, have the same commitment to individual freedom, to individual autonomy, to the individual ability to sort of assert what one wants or move about in the world in exactly the way one wants or treat other people in the way that you want to treat them. There are really powerful currents of individual self assertion that have a lot to do with the basic formations of American culture, and that I would say more particularly have a lot to do with some of these challenges and contradictions that I've been talking about so far in conversation with you. On the other hand, I think it's also important to acknowledge that the United States is composed of people who've come from many different places. When they come to the United States, they carry with them many different cultural traditions, many different ways of conceiving of the relationship between oneself and others. And those inheritances matter a great deal. The heritage that people carries matters. The heritage that people carry matters a great deal. And some of the more interesting developments that I talk about in the book, say movements for racial justice in Texas, for example, in the North Texas town of Denton that I talk about in the book, or efforts to secure the well being of refugees in the town of Fargo, North Dakota, that I talk about in another chapter of the book, or efforts to secure access to clean drinking water in the town of Hudson, in the town of Newburgh in the Hudson River Valley in upstate New York that I talk about in another chapter of the book. All of these different situations are situations in which people are coming together from different places, from different cultural backgrounds, and actually bringing commitments to collective well-being into focus, in part from those inheritances that have to do with ideas that they've learned to take seriously by virtue of who they are and who they come from, where they come from, but also by virtue of their own circumstances of personal and economic and social necessity. For as long as we've had deep currents of individualism that have sustained and supported the dominance of certain populations in the United States, we've also had other traditions of collective survival that marginalized populations of different kinds have had to rely on in order to survive those conditions of great deprivation and hardship. So I think we have to think about the cultural heritage of the United States as a little more complicated than we sometimes take it. And there are these different strands of a more individual sensibility on the one hand and more collective sensibilities on the other. And so much has to do with the amount of space we give to one as opposed to the other.
Dr. Anand, you connect large global crises like climate change and migration to everyday empathy. Why do you think people struggle to relate to distant suffering?
It's a real challenge. And in many ways, I don't think we can blame people for that. If it's hard enough looking after the people that you're closest to, if the circumstances of your life are so uncertain that you can, sort of barely keep your own family afloat or figure out how to move from one day to another or one week to another, yeah, trying to somehow take seriously the condition of people who are so far away or consequences for people who might come at some distant time in the future. it can be a challenge. On the other hand, I think it is also the case that there are many people that have practiced a deeper and more expansive awareness of that kind. My family is from South India. We're from the state of Tamil Nadu, and there's an idea. We come from southern Tamil Nadu, where one of the characteristic species of trees that you find in the rural landscape is the palmyra palm, what we call in Tamil the pane maram. And there's this notion that if you plant a palmyra palm, you don't plant it for yourself, you don't plant it for your children, you plant it for your grandchildren because it takes that long for the tree to come up and begin to bear fruit. That's just a very small example of a deeper form of thinking in time and thinking in relationship that I think many cultures possess. And so, in these situations where we face acute crises that have to do with climate or migration or any number of other things like the COVID pandemic, which I also write about in the book, it's really important to build on these different cultural legacies and to think about traditions we have of thinking beyond the present, because ultimately we are all invested, I would say, in the possibility of securing a decent future for those others we care about. The question is how we get there.
Professor, the book suggests that meeting strangers as potential kin is possible. More practical shift in mindset or behavior can help people move in that direction.
Well, it's something, again, that I have had to take seriously as an anthropologist, as someone who's made it my business to sort of spend a lot of time in places I don't quite belong and in the company of people I don't know very well. And in truth, I've been very lucky in this professional journey of mine because many people have, in fact, come to take me seriously as a son, as a brother, as a cousin, as a nephew, as a grandson. All these kin terms are terms that people have used in a fictive and imaginative way to describe their relationship with me. So it's something that I know is possible just simply through my own life experience. Now, I feel very lucky to have experienced that possibility myself, but I think all of us are familiar with it in one way or another. Once again, just to make a reference to a kind of Indian cultural reality, in Tamil, we have the phrase Rail Sneham, which I think probably means something similar in different Indian languages as well. The idea Rail Sneham is the idea of a friendship you develop on a train. If you're on a long train journey with someone, you're sharing a compartment for a long distance. You begin talking, you start sharing, and somehow, a certain kind of relationship develops simply by virtue of sharing space. That's something that I think everyone who's ridden the train in India is familiar with in one way or another, especially those of us who've taken long multi-day train journeys, which are really interesting experiences. The point is that situations and spaces of proximity do matter. Of course, it's true that you could be thrown into proximity with people that you can't stand and you have nothing in common with, and maybe you drive each other crazy. But I would say more often than not, people find a way to relate by virtue of the fact that they have to share space. And I think that that is one of the big lessons for me in this book, that if people are in a situation where they don't have to share space at all with other people they don't know or other people of other backgrounds, then that habit of striking up those conversations and relationships is going to be that much harder. So, one of the most important things is simply creating spaces and situations where people can come together with others that they don't know that well and simply practice that art of developing a sense of relationship or kinship or commonality, something shared with people that they didn't know they had that much in common with. So that's one very practical thing that I think we could all be thinking about. It isn't simply up to us as individuals to do this work. It's also about the extent to which our institutions, our governments, our civic structures and infrastructures can support the necessity of these spaces that allow for those kinds of connections to develop.
Professor, your current work connects globally from the US to India, Ghana, and Spain. Do you see similar everyday goals in other societies, or is it uniquely American?
Yeah, it's a really important question because the reality is that our lives in all of these countries are so deeply interwoven with the lives of others elsewhere. And those are interrelationships that I try to take very seriously in my own work. When I started doing this work around these different forms of fortification and isolation in the United States, oddly enough, one of the very first things that I was thinking about, one of the very first things I noticed is that there are practices of securing ourselves or ensuring our own well being on an individual basis that seem to have a certain kind of resonance with what's happening at a much larger national or international scale. To put it more clearly and specifically, I began to notice these strange ways in which one could trace parallels between what a candidate, a political candidate like Donald Trump, was telling the American public about the kinds of barriers it would take to secure that country, and what an industry like the plastic industry was telling American consumers about what it would take to make them safe, that somehow everything had to be sealed off for individual consumption and individual disposal if you truly wanted to ensure the cleanliness and hygiene of what you're ingesting and therefore the integrity and well-being of your own body. I began to see these parallels, and that was one of the things that got me thinking between these different scales of the body, the neighborhood, the home, the automobile, and ultimately the nation. And this new project of mine on the zero waste movement, which, as you mentioned a second ago, tries to think between these four countries, the United States, India, Ghana, and Spain, is one that is very much about the challenges of moving away from a disposable culture that people all over the world are slipping ever deeper into, and that's creating all kinds of environmental problems that are really, really difficult to handle. So that means developing different kinds of waste systems. It means investing in the reuse of things, investing in reinvesting in biodegradable things, but it also means questioning the cultural assumptions and commitments that have gotten us into these problems in the first place. And I think the way in which people have come to believe that the safest resource to depend on is one that remains sealed off until you open it up is one that we have to question. Companies have sold us this idea, and our infrastructures have been hollowed out such that we depend on promises of that kind. So the very question of securing our well-being in more collective terms has so much to do with our consumption habits, our disposal habits, and all the ways in which our society and our economy organize what we need and what happens to what we use when we're done with it. And so in that sense, I think these parallels in in our modern consumer economies are absolutely important to think about. It's what I'm writing about right now.
Professor Anand, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. Looking ahead, are you optimistic that these everyday walls can be dismantled, or are they becoming more deeply entrenched in modern life?
Yeah, it sort of depends day to day. I'd say that there are days that I wake up that I feel more optimistic, and there are days where I feel just as hopeless, to be honest, as so many others that we hear about and we know from our different social media feeds. People are expressing a great deal of concern right now about where the world is going. And it's something that I feel really personally myself because my wife and I, we have two children. They're 17 years old and 13 years old. And the question of the world we are passing over to them is something that it's hard not to think about and hard not to worry about. The argument that I make in the book is that countries like the United States, and perhaps countries like India as well, are very much at a crossroads. That on the one hand, we have these invitations to imagine our well being in much more isolated, divisive terms, where we imagine surrounding ourselves with people who are just like us. We imagine the idea that somehow we'll be better off if we don't have to share our space in our country and our neighborhoods with people of those different backgrounds, whether they're different religions or different languages or different races or ethnicities or what have you. So there's that direction in which things are going in many of these countries. But on the other hand, I would say people are also organizing for a different, more expansive, more inclusive picture of what these democratic polities could be and the forms of possibility that come uniquely into focus when people of different backgrounds can live together, work together, draw on their respective cultures and histories to devise different kinds of solutions to very sticky and challenging problems. I believe in that possibility. I tell a lot of hopeful stories in the book about forms of possibility of that kind that grow out of the differences that people have. And I think it's really important to do whatever we can to maintain space for those differences and to allow those differences to flourish and to allow a life in the midst of such differences to continue to flourish. Because one way or another, we share our countries, we share this planet with people who aren't like us. And we have to figure out what it takes to actually live with that reality.
Thank you, Professor Anand Pandian, for such a thoughtful and deeply reflective conversation. Your insights remind us that the divides we often see as a fix are, in many ways, built into the rhythms of our everyday lives, and that they can be also reimagined and reshaped. Something between us offers not just a diagnosis of our times, but a hopeful invitation to reconnect, to listen, and to rebuild a sense of shared humanity. It's been a pleasure having you with us today, and thank you once again for sharing insights from your publication. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Deepak. It's been really wonderful listening to your questions and your own reflections and having this chance to talk with you and all of your listeners. I really appreciate this opportunity.